The judge sat high on his bench, his expression carved in stone, unmoved, indifferent. Across the room, the police officer leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a smirk curling on his lips like he already knew the outcome. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and arrogance, the air thick with an unspoken understanding. This was not a place for justice, at least not today. She stood alone. Her heart pounded so hard it almost drowned out the judge's voice as he spoke, but she forced herself to listen. Every syllable cut deep, each word another slap to the face, another reminder of how this system was built to crush people like her. Given the overwhelming testimony of Officer Davidson, the judge's voice dripped with finality. This court finds you guilty on all counts. You will be taken into custody immediately. A murmur rippled through the gallery, but no one spoke up. No one dared. She swallowed the lump in her throat, her hands clenched at her sides, nails digging into her palms to keep from shaking. She had come here seeking justice, believing in the law, trusting that the truth would set her free. Instead, the truth had been twisted, drowned beneath the lies of a man in uniform, validated by a man in robes. She turned to face the officer who had destroyed her life. He looked right at her, his grin widening, his eyes alight with victory. "I told you," he muttered, voice low enough that only she could hear. "You should have just kept your mouth shut." Her breath caught. Rage swirled in her chest, hot and suffocating, but she had learned long ago that anger wouldn't save her here. She had to be smart. Calculated. The bailiff grabbed her arm, too rough, yanking her forward. She could feel the eyes of the jury on her, the weight of their silence pressing down like a second punishment. None of them had believed her. Or worse, maybe they had, but they didn't care. She wasn't supposed to fight back. She wasn't supposed to challenge the system. She was supposed to accept the hand she'd been dealt, no matter how cruel, no matter how unjust. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. As she was dragged toward the side door, as the chains around her wrists clinked against each other, as the officer leaned back in his chair with the kind of smug confidence that only came from knowing he would never face consequences, she smiled. Not a big smile. Just a flicker. Just enough. And in that moment, for the first time since she had stepped into this courtroom, the officer's smirk faltered. Just a little. Just enough. Because she knew something they didn't. Because this wasn't over. Because justice, real justice, was coming. And when it did, it wouldn't just take down the cop who had framed her. It wouldn't just expose the corruption rotting through this courtroom like a disease. It would destroy them. All of them. And when the truth finally came crashing down, when the weight of their own sins crushed them beneath it, when their perfect little world of lies collapsed right before their eyes, there would only be one thing left to say: they never saw it coming. But the question is, do you? Before we dive into this powerful story, we want to take a moment to send a message to our Black viewers. Plow of Twist stands firmly against racism, discrimination, and injustice in any form. We believe in the power of storytelling to expose the truth, inspire change, and empower those who have been silenced for too long. If you've ever felt unheard, dismissed, or judged unfairly because of the color of your skin, know this: your voice matters. Your story matters. And justice will always find its way. Now, get ready for a mind-blowing story of injustice, resilience, and the ultimate twist of karma. And if you love stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button, because here, your support means everything. Enjoy the story. The air inside the courtroom was thick, suffocating, a mixture of sweat, old wood, and the quiet but palpable stench of injustice. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered slightly, casting a dull glow over the room. The walls were lined with bookshelves filled with legal volumes that no one here actually cared to follow. The gavel sat idle on the judge's desk, polished, pristine, untouched by the reality of the lives it condemned every day. It was just another day in a system designed to protect the powerful and crush anyone who dared to challenge them. At the center of it all stood Naomi Carter, her wrists bound in cold steel, the weight of the moment pressing against her chest. She wasn't just standing trial, she was standing against something much larger, something that had been in place long before she was born. A system that wasn't meant for people like her. The air conditioning hummed softly in the background, a stark contrast to the heat rising in her body, a quiet reminder that some people in this room were perfectly comfortable. She was not one of them. Naomi wasn't supposed to be here. She had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, built a life that should have kept her far away from courtrooms like this. She was brilliant, methodical, someone who had learned early on that the world would never give her the benefit of the doubt. So she made sure she never needed it. She had fought tooth and nail for everything, her education, her career, her reputation. But none of that mattered now. Because when a police officer with a badge and a lie pointed his finger, the truth stopped existing. She could feel their eyes on her. The jury, the reporters in the back row, the people in the gallery who had shown up just to see a spectacle. Some of them already had their minds made up. Others were pretending they didn't. But it didn't matter. She knew how this worked. She had spent her entire life watching it happen to others, knowing that one day, it could be her. And now it was. Sitting across the room was Officer Brian Davidson, the man responsible for all of this. He was relaxed, one arm draped over the back of his chair, his fingers tapping idly against the wood. He wasn't worried. He never had to be. His uniform was crisp, his badge gleaming under the artificial light, a symbol of power that had never been questioned. He had been a cop for 15 years, and in all that time, no one had dared to challenge him and won. He had a reputation, not for being good at his job, but for knowing how to play the system, how to twist the narrative, how to make sure that when things went wrong, someone else took the fall. And sitting above them all, like a king on his throne, was Judge Richard Holloway. He was a man who had spent decades pretending he was the law, rather than someone merely enforcing it. His face was set in a permanent scowl, deep lines carved into his forehead from years of looking down on people who didn't fit his version of justice. He was the kind of judge who smiled in country clubs and frowned in courtrooms. He believed in maintaining order, but only the kind that protected men like Davidson. Naomi had seen judges like him before, cold, calculating, untouchable. And she knew, without a doubt, that the moment she stepped into this room, the verdict had already been decided. She had been accused of something she didn't do. Not just accused, framed. Officer Davidson had stood before the court, sworn under oath, and spun his lie with the ease of a man who had done it many times before. He had painted her as a criminal, a fraud, a danger to society. And the worst part? He didn't even have to try that hard. The moment she walked through those doors, a black woman in handcuffs, the world had already made up its mind. The trial had been a joke from the beginning. Her defense had been methodical, precise, built on facts, on evidence. But facts didn't matter when the people in power had already decided who they wanted to believe. Witness testimonies were dismissed, evidence was conveniently lost, and at every turn, she had been shut down. The prosecutor barely had to try. The jury barely had to think. And now, as the judge prepared to deliver his verdict, she could see it all so clearly. Davidson wasn't nervous. He wasn't worried. He was comfortable. Because men like him didn't lose. Not in places like this. Judge Holloway cleared his throat, his voice carrying over the silence. He spoke with the finality of a man who believed he was delivering justice, when in reality, he was just maintaining an illusion. His words were cold, rehearsed, detached. Given the overwhelming testimony of Officer Davidson, he began, and she already knew how this would end. This court finds you guilty on all counts. The words barely registered. She had prepared herself for this, told herself she wouldn't react, wouldn't let them see her break. But the weight of it still hit her like a freight train. The room was silent, but the silence was loud, filled with unspoken truths, with the understanding that this wasn't just about her. It never had been. Davidson exhaled slowly, like he had just finished a particularly satisfying meal. He turned his head slightly, catching her eye across the room, and the smirk that followed made her stomach twist. "I told you," he murmured, his voice just low enough for her to hear. "You should have just kept your mouth shut." She inhaled sharply, but she didn't respond. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. The bailiff moved toward her, reaching for her arm, and for a brief second, she considered resisting. Just for a moment. Just to feel like she still had some control. But she knew how that would end. And she had come too far to make a mistake now. Because the thing they didn't know, the thing they never saw coming, was that Naomi Carter wasn't just a victim. She wasn't just another black woman crushed beneath the weight of a broken system. She was something else entirely. And when the truth finally came to light, when their perfect, untouchable little world came crashing down around them, when justice finally found them, they would never forget her name. The cold steel of the handcuffs dug into Naomi Carter's wrists, the pressure increasing as the bailiff jerked them tighter, ensuring she felt every ounce of control being stripped away from her. The metal was unyielding, a sharp contrast to the warmth of her skin, and with every movement, the cuffs pressed deeper, leaving behind red indentations that she knew would linger long after this moment. She refused to wince, refused to give them that satisfaction, but deep inside, she could feel a slow burn of rage tightening in her chest. Every clink of the chains as she moved felt heavier, like a final nail being hammered into a coffin that had been waiting for her since the moment she walked into this courthouse. She had been dragged through this process like a prop in a play where the ending had already been written long before she had a chance to speak her lines. The courtroom around her was buzzing with a silent energy, a mixture of anticipation and finality. The walls were adorned with shelves of thick, leather-bound law books, their spines lined with dust, untouched, unread, their presence merely decorative rather than functional. The heavy wooden benches were filled with spectators, some whispering behind cupped hands, others staring blankly, their faces void of sympathy or concern. The air conditioning hummed steadily, a reminder that, despite the storm raging inside her, the world continued unaffected, indifferent. The judge's bench stood elevated above all, a towering reminder of authority, of power, of a system that had never been built for her. Judge Richard Holloway sat in his chair, his face impassive, his fingers idly tapping against the armrest as if this were just another mundane task in his otherwise unremarkable day. His expression remained unreadable, but Naomi had studied men like him long enough to recognize the arrogance beneath the mask of neutrality. He wasn't just delivering a verdict, he was reinforcing an unspoken rule. A reminder that people like her didn't get justice, only judgment. His robe draped over his shoulders like a king's mantle, his gavel an extension of his power, a tool he wielded with ease, sealing fates without a moment of hesitation. Across the room, seated with the comfort of a man who knew he was untouchable, was Officer Brian Davidson. His uniform was pressed to perfection, his badge gleaming under the courtroom's dim lighting, catching the eye like a deliberate taunt. His posture was casual, one arm draped over the back of his chair, fingers tapping idly against the wood, the picture of a man with nothing to fear. His face bore the expression of someone who had already won, someone who had played this game many times before and had never lost. His smirk was subtle but unmistakable, a silent declaration of victory. He had spun his story effortlessly, turning himself into the hero and Naomi into the villain, and now he was merely waiting for the curtain to close on this predictable performance. Naomi stood motionless, every muscle in her body taut, every instinct screaming at her to fight, to push back, to make them see the truth. But the truth had never mattered here. Facts had been twisted, evidence conveniently dismissed, her words reduced to background noise. They had built this case like a house of cards, fragile and insubstantial, yet in this courtroom, it might as well have been steel. She had watched as each piece fell into place, as the jury nodded along with Davidson's version of events, as the prosecutor barely had to lift a finger. The trial had been a mere formality, a box to be checked before they sent her away. And now, as Judge Holloway prepared to deliver his verdict, she felt the weight of inevitability pressing down on her shoulders, suffocating, unrelenting. The judge cleared his throat, his voice cold, devoid of emotion. Given the overwhelming testimony of Officer Davidson and the evidence presented before this court, he began, his tone carrying the weight of finality, this court finds the defendant guilty on all counts. A silence stretched across the room, thick and suffocating. Naomi barely registered the words, though she had known they were coming. She had steeled herself for this moment, had repeated the scenario over and over in her mind, had prepared herself for the injustice of it all. And yet, hearing it aloud, spoken with such ease, such certainty, sent a sharp stab of something deep into her chest. Davidson exhaled slowly, stretching his arms as though he had just finished a satisfying meal, his body language oozing with the smugness of a man who believed himself invincible. He turned slightly, catching Naomi's eye across the room, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to shrink to just the two of them. His lips curled into a smirk, his voice dropping to a whisper only she could hear. "I told you," he murmured, his words slow, deliberate, laced with condescension. "You should have just kept your mouth shut." Naomi's pulse pounded in her ears, a drumbeat of fury, of frustration, of something deeper, something darker. She inhaled sharply, her grip tightening against the chains around her wrists, but she didn't speak, didn't flinch. She wouldn't give him the reaction he wanted. The bailiff moved toward her, his hands rough as he grabbed her arm, guiding her toward the back of the courtroom. His grip was unnecessary, excessive, but she let him do it. She let them all believe they had control. She let them think they had one. Because the thing they didn't know, the thing they never saw coming, was that Naomi Carter wasn't just a victim. She wasn't just another black woman swallowed by the system. She was something else entirely. As they led her through the dimly lit hallway toward the holding cells, the fluorescent lights above flickered slightly, casting long, distorted shadows along the floor. The sound of footsteps echoed off the cold walls, a rhythmic march toward what they all believed was the end of her story. But Naomi knew better. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Somewhere in the courtroom, Davidson reached for his phone, his fingers swiping lazily across the screen, probably checking messages, already moving on from this case. He was comfortable, secure, convinced that today was just another victory, another name on his list. But then, a text popped up, the screen illuminating briefly. The message was short, clipped, urgent. "We need to talk. Now." It was from his captain. Davidson frowned, straightening slightly, his thumb hovering over the screen. Before he could type a response, another message came through, this time from a number he didn't recognize. Tick. Tock. A chill crept up his spine, slow and unwelcome. Judge Holloway looked up from his papers, raising an eyebrow. "Something wrong?" Davidson forced a smirk, slipping his phone back into his pocket. "Nothing. Just another case." But as he stood, stretching his arms, rolling his shoulders, trying to shake off the unease curling in his stomach, something felt off. Something was shifting. Something unseen. And deep in the back of his mind, buried beneath his arrogance, his certainty, his years of getting away with everything, there was a whisper. A small, nagging whisper that sounded almost like a warning. Because Naomi Carter wasn't just another case. And whatever was coming next, it was already too late to stop it. The courthouse had never felt this cold. The air was still, dense, thick with something that had not been there before. A slow, creeping tension seeped into the cracks of the wood-paneled walls, curling around the room like an unseen force, pressing down on the space between them. Officer Brian Davidson shifted in his seat, rolling his shoulders, trying to shake the gnawing discomfort that had settled in his gut. Something was wrong. He knew it. He felt it. But he didn't know what. The courtroom was nearly empty now, most people having filed out after Naomi Carter had been led away, but Judge Holloway remained, finishing his paperwork, his pen scratching against the surface in short, efficient strokes. Davidson's phone buzzed again in his pocket, the vibration rattling against his leg like an alarm he couldn't ignore. He pulled it out, his fingers tightening as he read the newest message. "Are you watching the news?" His brows pulled together. His thumb hesitated before opening the app, and when he did, his breath hitched. The screen was filled with her face. Naomi Carter. Not in handcuffs. Not in an orange jumpsuit. Not broken, not defeated. She was standing at a podium, her posture rigid, her eyes piercing through the camera, her voice steady, unwavering, controlled. Behind her stood a row of federal agents, suits crisp, expressions blank, and the banner scrolling beneath her image sent an icy shock through Davidson's veins. Breaking news: FBI agent exposes police corruption, unveils years of systemic cover UPS. Davidson's mouth went dry. His grip on the phone tightened as he scrambled to process what he was looking at, what he was hearing. Naomi's voice was calm, measured, each word a precise bullet aimed directly at the foundation of everything he had built, everything he had relied on to stay untouchable. For years, she was saying, corruption has thrived in this city, protected by the very people sworn to uphold justice. We have gathered undeniable proof of misconduct, falsified reports, wrongful convictions, and direct judicial collusion in efforts to silence and control those who dare to challenge authority. This is no longer speculation. These are facts, backed by evidence. Davidson felt the blood drain from his face. He stood abruptly, chair scraping against the floor, the sound sharp and jarring in the silence of the courtroom. Judge Holloway looked up, brows lifting in mild annoyance. "Something wrong, officer?" Davidson ignored him. His pulse was hammering against his skull, the edges of his vision blurring slightly. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be happening. Naomi was supposed to be in custody. She was supposed to be rotting in a cell, buried under the weight of a guilty verdict that had been pre-written before she even stepped into this room. But now she was on live television, broadcasting the truth to millions. He turned sharply, heading for the doors, but before he could reach them, they burst open. A wave of dark suits flooded the room, federal agents, badges glinting under the courtroom's harsh lighting, moving with purpose, with finality. Davidson barely had time to react before two of them stepped in front of him, their expressions unreadable, their posture rigid. One of them, a man with a sharp jawline and piercing eyes, pulled a document from his inside pocket, unfolding it with precision. "Officer Brian Davidson," he announced, his voice firm, unwavering, "you are under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, falsification of evidence, and multiple counts of perjury." The air left Davidson's lungs in a sharp exhale. His ears rang, a deafening hum drowning out everything else. "What the hell are you talking about?" His voice came out harsher than intended, rough with disbelief, with the first edges of panic cutting through his forced composure. "This is a mistake." The agent's expression didn't waver. "There's no mistake. You've been under federal investigation for months." Judge Holloway stood abruptly, his chair nearly toppling over. His face, normally so composed, so unreadable, twisted in barely concealed outrage. "This is ridiculous," he barked, his voice carrying through the chamber. "This man is an officer of the law." The agent turned his attention to him, his gaze unshaken. "And you, Judge Holloway, are also under investigation for judicial misconduct, bribery, and the unlawful sentencing of multiple innocent defendants." He pulled out a second document, unfolding it with the same deliberate slowness. "You are hereby suspended from your duties effective immediately, pending further legal action." The silence that followed was deafening. Davidson's breath was coming faster now, shallower, his body reacting before his mind could fully catch up. This wasn't just a bad day. This wasn't just a mistake. This was the end. Everything was crashing down around him, piece by piece, unraveling in real time. Naomi Carter had not just survived. She had outmaneuvered him. She had set him up. And she had won. He turned back to the screen, his pulse hammering, sweat forming at his temple. Naomi was still speaking, still dismantling the very system that had once believed itself indestructible. The people responsible will be held accountable, she said, her gaze steady, unwavering. No more silence. No more unchecked power. No more corruption without consequence. Her eyes flickered, just for a second, just long enough for Davidson to feel it, she was looking at him. Even through the screen, even from miles away, he felt the weight of it. The weight of justice finally coming for him. And then, for the first time in his life, Brian Davidson felt real fear. The weight of the moment pressed against Brian Davidson's chest, crushing, suffocating, inescapable. The fluorescent lights above cast a harsh glow over the courtroom, making everything feel too bright, too exposed, as if the walls themselves were closing in around him. He could hear the sound of his own breathing, sharp and uneven, the hammering of his pulse a deafening roar in his ears. The agents in front of him didn't move, didn't flinch, their eyes locked onto him with the quiet authority of men who knew they had already won. His mind raced, desperately trying to piece together an escape, a way out, an explanation that could undo what was happening. But no words came. His throat was dry, his tongue heavy, his entire body frozen in place. He had been in control. He had been the one pulling the strings, dictating the narrative, ensuring that people like Naomi Carter never got the last word. And yet, here he was, standing in the wreckage of his own arrogance, staring down the end of everything he had built. Judge Holloway was still standing behind his bench, his hands gripping the edge of the desk so tightly his knuckles had turned white. His face was twisted in barely concealed fury, his breath coming in short bursts, his mind likely scrambling for the same kind of lifeline that Davidson had been searching for. But there was none. The courtroom, once their domain, now felt foreign, hostile, a battleground where they had already lost. Davidson swallowed hard, forcing his voice to work. "This is a mistake," he said, the words tumbling out in a rushed, uneven breath. You're making a mistake. You don't understand. This is all a setup, it's a goddamn setup." The lead agent remained unfazed. "The only mistake made here was thinking you were untouchable." His voice was even, measured, completely devoid of sympathy. "You can deny it all you want, but the evidence speaks for itself. You lied under oath. You falsified reports. You framed innocent people. And now, you're going to answer for it." Davidson shook his head violently, his fingers twitching at his sides. No, you don't get it. She's lying. That woman, she's been planning this from the start. She's manipulating you. You don't know what she's capable of." At that, a dry, humorless laugh came from the back of the courtroom. The sound sent a cold chill down Davidson's spine before he even turned to look. Naomi Carter. She stepped forward, her posture relaxed, her expression unreadable, but her eyes burned with something deep, something unshakable. She wasn't shackled anymore, wasn't restrained, wasn't a prisoner. She stood free, untouchable, a woman who had won. Davidson's stomach twisted. "You really don't get it, do you?" Naomi's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, sharp enough to slice through the air between them. "Even now, when the entire world is watching, when the truth is being dragged into the light, you still think you can talk your way out of this? That you can twist the narrative just one more time? That you can make everyone believe your version of the story? But you can't. Not anymore." Davidson's fists clenched. "You set me up." Naomi tilted her head slightly, her lips curving in something that was almost amusement, almost pity. "I didn't have to set you up, Davidson. You did that all on your own." His face twisted, desperation creeping into his features. "This is bullshit. This is political, this is a witch hunt. You think people like you can just walk in and tear everything down? You think the system works that way?" Naomi's gaze didn't waver. No. I know exactly how the system works. It works for men like you. It protects men like you. It allows men like you to destroy lives without ever facing consequences. Until today. Judge Holloway exhaled sharply, finally finding his voice. You think you've won something here? His voice was tight, laced with frustration, with anger, with the dying breath of a man who had never tasted true defeat before. You think dragging this into the public eye will change anything? You think you can bring down the entire foundation of this system with one case? You're naive. Naomi's expression remained steady, unwavering. Not naive. Just patient. Holloway scoffed, shaking his head. People like Davidson, people like me, we don't fall. Not really. There will always be another seat for us, another position, another way back. You think the world is going to change overnight? You think the people who built this system are going to just step aside because of a few headlines? Naomi took another step forward, closing the distance between them. No, she admitted, her voice quiet but firm. But you will. And that's enough for now. Holloway's jaw tightened, the reality of his situation finally, truly settling in. For the first time, there was something behind his eyes that hadn't been there before, fear. Not just of losing his position, not just of the scandal, but of the unknown. He had always been the one holding the gavel, the one dictating the sentences, the one who decided the fates of others. But now, his own fate was no longer in his hands. Davidson, on the other hand, was still scrambling, still grasping at something, anything, to pull himself back from the edge. His breath came faster, his skin turning pale, beads of sweat collecting at his hairline. I have connections, he said, voice frantic, nearly trembling. I have people who can make this go away. You don't know what you're doing, Carter. You don't, Naomi cut him off, her voice sharp. Your connections are the ones handing you over. Davidson stopped. His lips parted slightly, his breath caught in his throat. Naomi let the silence hang for a moment, let him feel it settle, let the truth sink in. Did you really think you were their priority? Her voice was almost gentle, almost cruel in its softness. You were useful until you weren't. And now? Now, you're just a liability. Davidson's shoulders slumped, the fight bleeding out of him. His hands shook slightly as he exhaled, his gaze darting between Naomi and the agents, between Holloway and the looming door. He was trapped, surrounded, cornered in a way he had never been before. And there was no way out. The lead agent stepped forward, pulling a pair of cuffs from his belt. Brian Davidson, you are under arrest. You have the right to remain silent. Davidson let out a strangled noise, half a curse, half a breathless gasp, as the agent grabbed his wrists and secured the cuffs around them. The sound of metal clicking into place echoed through the courtroom, ringing out like a final, undeniable truth. Naomi watched, standing tall, standing victorious. Davidson turned his head, his eyes locking onto hers one last time. There was no smugness now, no arrogance, no smirk. Just the hollow, dawning realization that this was what justice felt like. Naomi inhaled slowly, letting the moment settle, letting the weight of it sink deep into her bones. This wasn't just about Davidson. This wasn't just about Holloway. This was about every single person who had ever stood in a courtroom like this, knowing the system was already rigged against them. Today, the system lost. And she? She had just rewritten the rules. The courtroom was no longer the same place it had been just hours ago. The air that had once been thick with silent agreements, quiet corruption, and unshaken authority now felt charged, heavy, different. It wasn't just the arrests, the downfall of those who had ruled unchallenged for so long, it was something deeper, something unspoken. A shift. A realization that power had changed hands, even if only for a moment. Naomi Carter stood still, watching as Brian Davidson was led out in cuffs, his step stiff, mechanical, a man who had never imagined this moment could exist. His head was lowered slightly, his shoulders no longer squared with the arrogance they once carried, his face pale, drained of its usual confidence. The press had swarmed outside, their cameras and microphones waiting to capture every single second of this historic collapse. This wasn't just an arrest. This was a reckoning. Judge Holloway remained standing behind his desk, his breath coming in short, measured inhales, but his hands betrayed him, the way his fingers gripped the desk just a little too tightly, the way his knuckles had turned stark white against his tanned skin. His eyes flickered between Naomi and the agents, darting, calculating, his mind working faster than his body could keep up. He was weighing his options, searching for a loophole, a way out, a last-minute salvation. But there was none. One of the agents approached the bench, placing an official document in front of him, and Holloway's gaze flickered down. His expression barely changed, but Naomi saw it, the brief, fleeting flicker of something close to panic. "You understand what this means," the agent's voice was steady, factual, leaving no room for interpretation. "You are hereby suspended from your judicial duties indefinitely, pending a full investigation into allegations of misconduct, conspiracy, and bribery." Holloway exhaled sharply, running his tongue over his lower lip, his jaw tightening as his fingers smoothed down the document, lingering over the edge of the paper like he was memorizing the texture of his own downfall. Naomi stepped forward slightly, her presence deliberate, her voice clear. "This is only the beginning." Holloway's gaze snapped up, meeting hers for the first time since the chaos had erupted. There was something behind his eyes now, not just anger, not just frustration, but something deeper, something heavier. Resignation. "You think this is justice?" His voice was quieter now, lower, the arrogance stripped down to something rawer, something more human. "You think tearing us down will change anything?" Naomi held his stare, unwavering, unshaken. "I think it's a start." A long silence stretched between them, thick and electric. This was the moment where the past met the future, where the weight of what had been done came crashing against the possibility of what could come next. Holloway exhaled slowly, finally breaking eye contact, his shoulders slumping just slightly, his posture losing its rigid composure. He turned to the agent standing beside him, nodding, as if surrendering to the inevitable. He didn't fight when they asked him to remove his judicial robe, didn't argue as they collected his belongings, didn't resist as they escorted him out of the courtroom, the symbol of his power stripped away in an instant. As the doors shut behind them, Naomi stood in the silence that followed, the echoes of what had just happened still hanging in the air. The courtroom, once a fortress of absolute control, now felt hollow, emptied of the power it once carried. But this wasn't over. Outside, the streets were alive with something Naomi had never seen before, people gathering, murmurs growing into conversations, conversations into declarations. The press cameras were capturing everything, flashing in bursts of light, microphones pointed in every direction, eager for more, hungry for the unraveling of everything that had been kept hidden for so long. A woman from the crowd, mid-40s, her face worn with the kind of exhaustion that only comes from years of fighting battles no one else sees, caught Naomi's eye. She was standing near the courthouse steps, gripping the railing as if grounding herself, her lips parted slightly, like she wanted to say something but wasn't sure if she should. Naomi took a step toward her. And then another. Until she was standing close enough to hear her voice when she finally spoke. "You did it," the woman whispered, the words barely above the chaos around them. "You actually did it." Naomi's chest tightened slightly. "Did I?" Because as much as this felt like a victory, as much as this moment felt powerful, undeniable, irreversible, she knew this was just one battle. Not the war. Her voice was steady when she answered. "We did." The woman let out a sharp breath, something between a laugh and a sob, her fingers tightening around the railing. Naomi watched as the realization washed over her, not just for herself, but for every single person who had ever sat in a courtroom and known the truth wouldn't save them. The weight of that was overwhelming. And yet, Naomi stood taller. Because this wasn't about her. It never had been. Inside the courthouse, Holloway and Davidson were being processed, their mugshots already leaking online, the internet flooding with reactions, debates, a wildfire of truth spreading faster than anyone could contain. And for the first time in her life, Naomi Carter didn't feel powerless. But she also knew, this was far from over. Because the system didn't break in a single day. And neither would she. The city pulsed with an energy unlike anything Naomi Carter had ever felt before. The courthouse, once an untouchable fortress of power and privilege, now stood exposed, stripped of its illusions, reduced to nothing more than a building of walls and doors that could no longer contain the weight of the truth. The steps leading down to the street were packed with people, some celebrating, some watching in stunned disbelief, others still uncertain, waiting to see what came next. The air was thick with voices, overlapping questions from journalists, hushed conversations among onlookers, the sound of cameras clicking like rapid fire, catching every second of the aftermath of a moment that was not supposed to happen. Naomi stood in the eye of the storm, her posture strong, steady, her pulse slowing only slightly after the storm of what had just transpired. Everything had unraveled so quickly, yet so precisely. Brian Davidson and Richard Holloway, two men who had spent years, decades, an entire lifetime manipulating the system, twisting the law into something that served only them, had fallen within a matter of hours. The very foundation they had built their power on had collapsed beneath them, and Naomi had been the one to pull the thread that unraveled it all. Now, the world wanted answers. Microphones were shoved in her direction, voices colliding with each other in a chaotic mess of questions, each reporter desperate to get their quote first, to be the one to capture the headline that would define this moment. Naomi, what was your strategy in exposing the corruption? How long were you undercover? Did you know this would happen? What's next for you? Are you going after more officials? What do you say to those who claim this was politically motivated? Her heartbeat was steady now, her breathing controlled, her mind clear. She had spent years preparing for moments like this, but nothing could have prepared her for the weight of being the center of it. Every word she spoke now would be scrutinized, dissected, analyzed under a microscope. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about something bigger, something beyond the courtroom, beyond Holloway, beyond Davidson. She took a slow breath before speaking, making sure her voice was calm, unwavering, absolute. This isn't just about me, she said, her gaze scanning the crowd, making sure they understood the gravity of what had just happened. This is about every single person who has ever walked into a courtroom knowing the truth wouldn't save them. Every family that had to grieve in silence while the system protected the people responsible for their pain. Every innocent life that was buried under false charges, every voice that was drowned out by the weight of corruption. The murmurs quieted slightly, reporters lowering their microphones just a fraction, their expressions shifting from hungry for a soundbite to actually listening. This is not the first time the system has tried to bury the truth, she continued, her voice steady, firm, powerful. But today, the truth fought back. Holloway and Davidson were protected for years, not because they were good at their jobs, but because they knew how to play a game that was never meant to be fair. And today, for the first time, they lost. But this isn't the end. She let the words hang in the air for a moment, letting their weight settle, making sure they were not just heard, but felt. This does not end with them, she said, her gaze sharp, focused. Because they were never the only ones. Because this system does not change in a day. Because if we stop here, if we act like this was enough, then we will have won nothing. Real justice isn't about a single conviction. Real justice is about making sure this never happens again. The crowd was still, absorbing her words, the gravity of the moment pressing down on them like an undeniable truth. And then, just beyond the flashing cameras and the flood of reporters, she saw her. The woman from before. The one who had stood gripping the courthouse railing, staring at Naomi with something close to disbelief, like she was afraid to believe that any of this was real. Now, she was pushing through the edge of the crowd, her steps hesitant at first, then stronger, her expression shifting from uncertainty to something deeper, something raw. Naomi knew before she even spoke what she was going to say. "My son," the woman's voice trembled, but it carried, cutting through the noise, through the cameras, through everything. He was one of them. One of the ones they covered up. She swallowed hard, and Naomi could see the pain etched into her face, the exhaustion, the years of fighting battles that no one had wanted to listen to. "I spent years trying to get someone to care. Watching them walk free. Watching them act like he never existed." Naomi felt those words like a blade to the chest. There was no way to respond, no words that could possibly fill the space of what had been taken from this woman, from so many others like her. The woman's hands shook slightly as she exhaled, her voice breaking just a little. "But today, I saw something I didn't think I'd ever see. I saw them lose." The words hit Naomi harder than she expected. Her throat tightened, her chest ached, because she understood exactly what the woman meant. Because for the first time, the system had failed the men it was designed to protect. She could have responded with another speech. She could have promised more investigations, more action, more justice. But words weren't enough right now. They had never been enough for this woman. For anyone who had suffered under the weight of the system's silence. So Naomi did the only thing that mattered. She reached out, hesitated for only a second before gently placing her hand over the woman's. It wasn't a victory. It wasn't closure. But it was something. And right now, for this woman, for this moment, it had to be enough. The crowd was silent, watching, witnessing. Naomi knew that this was only the beginning, that there were still battles ahead, still names that needed justice, still people who would fight to keep the system exactly as it was. But today, the balance had shifted. For the first time, the system had been forced to face itself in the mirror. For the first time, it had broken. And Naomi? Naomi Carter had just proven that it was never unbreakable to begin with. The energy in the air had shifted, thickened, taken on a weight that pressed down on every person standing outside the courthouse. The crowd that had once been a chaotic storm of voices, reporters yelling over each other, cameras flashing in rapid succession, and murmurs of disbelief rippling through onlookers, had quieted. Not because the moment had passed, but because they were beginning to realize it hadn't. This was not an ending. This was not just a story for tonight's news cycle. This was a fracture in something much larger, something that had been unshaken for decades, maybe longer. Naomi Carter stood at the center of it all, and she felt it. The eyes on her, the expectations settling onto her shoulders, the weight of something that had grown beyond herself, beyond Davidson, beyond Holloway. They were gone, but the system they had thrived in was still standing. And the question that now hung in the air, unspoken but undeniable, was simple: what happens next? The woman whose son had been one of the forgotten cases, the ones covered up, the ones buried beneath fabricated reports and falsified evidence, was still standing in front of Naomi, her fingers now gripping Naomi's hand as if she needed to hold on to something tangible, something real. Naomi could see it in her eyes, the silent plea, the quiet desperation. Tell me this meant something. Tell me this isn't where it ends. Tell me this fight doesn't stop here. Naomi exhaled slowly, steadying herself, because the weight of what this woman needed was heavier than any courtroom battle, heavier than any headline or conviction. This wasn't about proving Davidson was corrupt. This was about proving that people like him couldn't exist in the dark anymore. That the system that had protected them was finally being forced into the light. A voice from the crowd broke through the moment, sharp, urgent. Naomi. What about the other cases? The ones that never made it to court? Another followed, louder. Are you going after the department next? The ones who covered for Davidson? The ones who let this happen? Then another, more pointed, more direct. What happens to the people still inside because of men like him? The ones who don't have a voice? The questions came faster now, growing, pressing in from all sides. The air buzzed with expectation, with a demand that had been waiting for an answer long before today. This wasn't just about Davidson anymore. This was about every name that had been buried, every injustice that had been shrugged off as just another loss, another case, another life that was never meant to matter in the eyes of the system. Naomi lifted her chin slightly, her voice steady when she finally spoke. This was never just about them, she said, letting the words settle, letting the truth take root. Holloway and Davidson fell because they thought they were untouchable. Because they believed the system would always protect them, no matter what. And for a long time, it did. But they weren't the only ones who believed that. They weren't the only ones who built their careers on the backs of the innocent. This doesn't end here. It can't. Because if we stop now, if we let this moment be the final chapter, then everything they did will still have won. The murmurs grew, shifting from speculation to something stronger. Conviction. Determination. Understanding. She turned slightly, scanning the faces before her, people she had never met but who now needed her to be something more than just a name in a courtroom battle. Justice isn't about a single case. It's not about one trial, one conviction, one corrupt cop or one crooked judge. Justice is about making sure this never happens again. And that means we keep going. That means we don't stop at Davidson. That means we don't stop at Holloway. That means we take every name they buried and we bring them back to the surface. Every case that was silenced. Every family that was ignored. Every person who sat in a cell knowing they weren't supposed to be there. A voice rang out from the crowd, strong, clear. So what do we do? Naomi met the question head on. We don't let this die. We don't let them sweep this under the rug like every other time. We make sure that the people in power know we're watching. That this system doesn't get to pretend it's fixed just because we took down 2 of its players. The real work starts now. And that means we don't back down. The woman still gripping Naomi's hand squeezed tighter, and Naomi understood why. It wasn't just about justice for her son. It was about making sure no other mother ever had to stand here, clinging to the hope that someone might care. More voices joined now, layering over one another, feeding into something that felt bigger than any press conference, bigger than any speech. A shift was happening. Not just in the legal system, but in the way people refused to look away this time. A reporter at the front finally found his opening, voice steady but pressing. So what's next for you, Naomi? Are you staying with the FBI? Are you running for office? What happens now? Naomi paused, because she hadn't let herself think about that yet. She had spent months, years, building up to this moment, but she had never let herself consider what came after. What happened once the men she had been chasing were finally caged? What happened once the cameras turned toward her, expecting her to be something more than just the woman who had exposed the truth? She could say she was stepping back, letting the justice system handle the rest. She could say her job was done, that she had done what she came here to do. But that would be a lie. Because the truth was, Naomi Carter wasn't done yet. She looked back at the courthouse, at the towering pillars that had once symbolized something unbreakable but now felt like just another building, no longer capable of hiding the truth inside it. Her voice, when she finally spoke, carried through the crowd, through the cameras, through every single person waiting to hear what came next. I don't know yet, she admitted, and that was the most honest thing she could say. But I know one thing for sure. This fight isn't over. The words landed. A ripple spread through the crowd, through the moment, through something much bigger than Naomi Carter. Because for the first time in a long time, people believed it. The courthouse no longer loomed over Naomi Carter like it once had. The stone pillars, the high arched ceilings, the judge's bench that had once seemed untouchable, all of it now felt smaller, stripped of the illusion of power it had wielded for so long. The trial had ended, the gavel had fallen, but the real verdict had been delivered long before that moment. The world had seen what had happened here. There was no erasing it, no twisting the narrative, no retreating into the safety of closed-door corruption. The truth had already spread too far, reached too many, and now, there was no turning back. Brian Davidson had been transferred to a maximum security federal prison, awaiting his sentencing with no hope of a reduced term. The charges against him had grown in the days following his arrest. As more cases were dug up, more victims came forward, more officers who had once worked beside him turned against him to save themselves. His name, once protected by the uniform he wore, was now spoken only in disgrace. He had lost everything, his badge, his rank, the shield that had allowed him to move through life untouched. He was no longer the hunter. He was the hunted now. Inside his cell, he no longer carried the smug confidence that had once defined him. His hands, once so steady when writing false reports, now trembled as he ran them over his face. He had spent years making sure people like Naomi Carter never won. And yet, here he was. Trapped. Forgotten. Powerless. Judge Holloway had been publicly disbarred, his career dismantled in the most humiliating fashion possible. Investigations had exposed years of financial ties to dirty cops, unethical rulings, manipulated evidence. What had once been a legacy of power was now a stain that would follow him to his grave. He had tried to fight it at first, to throw his weight around, to use his connections to find a way out, but he quickly realized what Davidson had, that the people who once protected him had no use for him anymore. The system he had dedicated his life to maintaining had discarded him without hesitation, without a second thought. He had once told Naomi that men like him didn't fall. But he had. And when he finally understood that there would be no redemption, no way back, he disappeared from the public eye, nothing more than a ghost of his former self, a man who had gambled with power and lost. And then there was Naomi. Her name was everywhere now. Not as a victim. Not as an accused criminal. Not even just as an FBI agent. She had become something else entirely. A symbol of something that people had stopped believing in, a system that could be challenged. A force that couldn't be silenced. A reminder that power could shift if the right person had the courage to tear it from the hands of those who abused it. But power was never something Naomi had wanted. She had never fought for recognition, never chased the spotlight. She had stepped into this fight because she had no choice, because if she didn't, then who would? Now, standing outside the courthouse for what she knew would be the last time, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Relief. It wasn't over. She knew that. There were still more names, still more cases, still more people who had been crushed under the weight of a broken system. But today, it had cracked. As she stepped down onto the street, the same woman who had approached her before was waiting, standing near the sidewalk, eyes filled with something different this time. Not just grief. Not just exhaustion. But hope. Naomi stopped in front of her, waiting, giving her space to speak if she wanted to. The woman inhaled deeply, steadying herself before saying, "I thought I'd die before I ever saw someone like them lose." Her voice wavered, but there was strength beneath it. "But you made them lose." Naomi held her gaze. "We made them lose," she corrected gently. The woman let out a breath, almost a laugh, almost a sob. "I want to believe this will keep going," she admitted, her fingers gripping her coat like she was holding on to the last thread of something fragile. "I want to believe this wasn't just a moment." Naomi didn't hesitate. "Then don't let it be." The woman nodded slowly, something shifting in her eyes. "Not certainty. Not yet. But the beginning of something real." And Naomi knew that was the most important victory of all. As Naomi walked away, the weight in her chest was still there, but it wasn't the same weight she had carried before. It wasn't the suffocating pressure of injustice, of knowing the fight was impossible to win. It was something lighter. The weight of knowing the fight wasn't impossible at all. And as she disappeared into the city, leaving behind the courthouse, the cameras, the questions, she knew one thing for certain: she had done what they said she never could. And she wasn't done yet. "But now, let me ask you something. How many times have you seen injustice and looked away because you thought nothing could be done? How many times have you told yourself that the system was too powerful, too rigged, too unbreakable? How many times have you thought that fighting back wasn't worth it because you were just one person? Naomi Carter was just one person. And yet, she changed everything. What would happen if more people did the same? What would happen if we stopped believing that corruption was untouchable? That justice was impossible? That power could never change hands? Because today, you saw what happens when someone refuses to back down. And if this story proves anything, it's that change starts with one person who refuses to accept the way things are. So tell me, what would you do if you knew you couldn't be silenced? If this story made you think, if it made you feel something, if it made you question the world around you, then don't let this moment end here. Subscribe to Tales of Twist and be part of more stories that challenge, that expose, that remind us that justice is not just a dream, it's a fight worth winning.